Well, thank you so much for having me. So I have 45 minutes. And thank you all, those of you who are online and those of you who are here in person, for indulging me for the next little while. I've given some versions of this talk, including in this building before. So I hope that Eduard will not get bored. So I got some extra new stuff, Eduard. So you can fall asleep now, but I can wake you up in about 10 minutes. But maybe you want to stay awake because, I mean, obviously the topic of this conversation for the next half an hour is the one that is concerning the pressing matters. You know about the pandemic, the refugee crisis, the climate crisis, and the currently ongoing war in my home country, Ukraine. And in many of those type of situations where we have natural disasters, geopolitical tensions, there are no clear-cut right or wrong answers to what to do. The pandemic was a good example of that. If you remember, there's been constantly an ongoing discussion about what should we do. Should we follow some moral principles about freedom, protection of the family, or protection of the most vulnerable in the society? And different moral standards can be applied to justify either of those choices. But how do you navigate that uncertainty? How can you figure out, how can you reason through the problems, including the serious geopolitical problems that we are facing today? So when I am talking about it, I'm talking about what moral principles can you apply in this type of situation? And we know that in psychology, and I'm a psychologist, that intelligence is not sufficient for that, because even smart people can make very silly and stupid decisions. They're subject to confirmation bias. In fact, you can be even more prone to confirmation bias if you are very smart and can generate a bazillion number of arguments in support of your position and then convince yourself that you were right all along. We also know that in the context of the ill-defined or wicked problems, rationality, at least the way it is defined in economics and cognitive science, probably not enough, because it often assumes knowledge of an optimal solution. You should know what the utility of different preferences would be. It doesn't really fit the situation which you don't. By definition, ill-defined complex problems are those where you don't know the preferences of other agents. They are uncertain. Also, in economics, rationality assumes self-interest, and at least since Rawls, we know that that may not necessarily be the only way that how people make decisions. They are not necessarily following self-interest. In fact, often we fail at that. Okay, maybe we just need more morality. It's like maybe if you give people more morals, moral awareness, then they will be able to solve those problems better. That's also problematic because abstract morals don't really help you figure out how to apply them to the given context. You need to know under what circumstances one particular moral standard would fit the situation and the other one would not. And also, as I presented with this COVID example, often moral standards are in conflict with each other in everyday life, in contrast to the hypothetical situations we may create in our labs, in the vignettes that we presented today and yesterday. So what could be the solution? Well, Aristotle suggested that practical wisdom could be the solution. So here's the new idea where wisdom is a form of some kind of an adjudicating meta virtue or a metacognitive process, as psychologists would call it, where you would focus not necessarily on some kind of abstract ideals of what good life is, which is, by the way, one form of the definitions of wisdom, or a term that is often used in everyday life to describe something that's just a good thing to do. So there's, oh, this was very wise of you. Post hoc. A priori, you would never know, but post hoc, you would say, oh yeah, this was very wise. Well, it's not very satisfactory. So psychologists often focus on this middle part, middle range explanations about processes, about how do you make sense of complex situations. And that's, I think, very Aristotelian in some ways, because it tells you about like how would you navigate a challenging situation? How would you discern what fits this situation versus another one? Okay, so that's where I want to start. And when I talk about wisdom, the first thing that I noticed is that like for many constructs in psychology and cognitive science, and I'm totally not Popperian here, because I know that Popper didn't like conceptual clarity. At least he claimed so in some of interviews. But, you know, whatever. The issue is we have a lot of problems if we don't talk about the same thing. For instance, when we talk about wisdom, we could mean 20 different things. We could mean one term that would describe multiplicity of quite different things. Or sometimes people use related terms. People talk about intellectual humility. People talk about perspective taking or empathy. People talk about some kind of willingness to be open-minded, but often not under the same umbrella term, often not really relating them to each other. And in methodology, in psychological methodology, you would describe those as jingle and jangle fallacies. And often the second one is used to advance your career, especially if you're a junior scientist. It's easier to come up with a new term to rebrand it instead of talking about the same old thing that everybody else has been talking about. We have a lot of examples for that. We have examples for empathy, for humility, for mindfulness, for rationality. When I started doing research on wisdom, I encountered that this is also true for wisdom. Now, the problem is that if you don't agree on what the foundations are, you would have lack of convergence that you can build on and develop a cumulative science where people can then understand what is it actually that you are measuring, what is it actually that is at the foundation that you can build on. And so a while ago, to resolve this issue for wisdom and to understand what scholars actually agree on, and this is not a psychological, it's more of, I guess more like cognitive science exercise that is not Popperian. I surveyed a large number of scientists, and I also then invited some of them to come to Toronto, where I lived at that time, to become part of the Wisdom Task Force, where we assembled and we were able to discuss things and hashed out what is actually at the core of the construct from a psychological perspective. What is it actually that people are measuring? They're claiming to measure different things, but what are they measuring? And we did this in Toronto, but also before that, as I said, like I sent out massive surveys to various groups, including moral psychology group and judgment and decision making, cognitive science society, and so on. And then we got responses from over 50 working groups from all over the world. And then we coded what they described as the sort of their working definition of wisdom on the set of characteristics. And I thought there would be a lot of disagreements. And of course, there was some, but there was some agreement on some features. And I found that quite interesting. So what you see here is the most frequently mentioned processes that scientists often talk about when they talk about wisdom. And in color, you see that one of the most common ones reflect some kind of balancing different perspectives, considering different perspectives, paying attention to the context, epistemic or intellectual humility, recognizing limits of your knowledge, in other words, management of uncertainty. And then there's this orange cluster of either morality, prosociality, moral disposition, or sympathy. So those are the two sort of most common features. And see what I did there? I did not tell you what I mean by wisdom. I just relied on everybody else in the community to do that. It's a beautiful trick. So you can't really tell me this is, if my definition of wisdom is wrong. That's the community. Okay, now why metacognition? Why does it seem to be so central? Well, here's an example for intellectual humility, which is often used as one component of wisdom, but also is worth studying in the current age, an age in its own right. You can say that, for instance, metacognition could involve valuing others' beliefs, it's about behaviors, it's about expressions, it's about potential motives, but really at the core of this construct, and the same is true probably for many other features, including perspective taking, including open-mindedness, at least the cognitive aspect of open-mindedness, you would have this metacognitive component. It's really this kind of regulatory tool that allows you to think better and to integrate your affective and motivational processes in this as you're thinking. So that's what I mean here by metacognition. Now, back then, this was right before the pandemic. We got together and when we discussed what sort of like could be the key features of wisdom, my colleagues and I proposed the so-called common wisdom model, where we said that, look, yes, you have this kind of metacognitive processes as the central features potentially of the construct. And I will call them wise reasoning because they're essentially about reasoning. But what's also very important is to consider context and consider that there is some kind of a moral grounding. And we can discuss that at the end. What exactly does that mean? But for me, what's really important is like, why is it that we focus on this metacognitive process? And we try to unpack this in a conceptual sort of theoretical piece. We suggested that part of the reason is that it is the way to implement abstract moral concepts and to figure out how they apply in everyday life, like true to this kind of Aristotelian ideas. They also allow you to see through illusion and self-deception sometimes. If you engage in great intellectual humility exercises, if you consider perspectives of others, there's a greater chance you'll recognize if you're deceiving yourself, which could be another way to even define wisdom. And maybe there is sort of also an evolutionary ecological argument, even though I'm hesitant there because it's obviously speculative, where one could say that this type of more metacognitive wise reasoning process, if you want, are necessary for survival, in part because they allow you to coordinate better in your group. And they also allow you to handle the uncertainty of a risky, uncertain environment in various societies much better because they allow you for better planning, well, including devising different alternative plans. Okay, so this is the model we've proposed. And so what I want to spend the next maybe 10, 15 minutes on is support for this model, including some new stuff. So Eduard can wake up now. So the first piece of evidence here comes from a range of studies where we find that this type of deliberation in various contexts, be it in the context of political decision-making, in the context of economic games, is often associated with either adaptive conflict resolution, or it's associated with cooperation, or even as associated with less affective polarization towards outgroups. So there is some evidence even that it relates to interpersonal well-being, even though that's purely correlational. I particularly want to draw your attention to some of this new work that I was sort of not involved in, this new paper by my former student Justin Brienza, where they find that this type of metacognitive processes tend to be aligned with a less attitude polarization in various contexts, be it about the Supreme Court decisions about the gay marriage earlier, or attitudes towards people who don't follow the same type of rules about COVID as you do, or attitudes towards outgroup during various revolutions in Asia or in North America. One thing I want to draw attention to here, this is by the way, Justin, is this really cool set of studies about cooperation. Now, we decided to focus on so-called public goods game. In the public goods game, you have a common pool that you establish by contributing, and everybody who contributes, well, everybody actually who is part of the game can benefit from whatever is contributed into the common pool. And economists, would suggest that you should not be putting anything in because you'll get the extra bonus. And that's the economically rational thing to do. But of course, the maximum contribution the maximum extra gain would be if everybody contributes. So it's almost like a little bit of a trust game. So we want to see to what extent this type of reasoning processes are linked to contribution in this type of public goods game. And what we find is that we measured this type of metacognitive processes, including intellectual humility, open-mindedness, perspective taking, on an independent task first. It's either before or after the game, so we randomized the order. And we look at the relationship of the people who either score 1 standard deviation below or above to how much they contribute as a function of deliberating on the choice they're supposed to be making. And what you see here is very interesting. First of all, there's a main effect difference. Those people who reason more wisely about their interpersonal matters, they tend to contribute more. But this is particularly the case for those people who deliberate. We also see that, well, for low-wise reasoners, the more they deliberate, the less they contribute, whereas for those people who are reasoning more wisely, if anything, the pattern is reversed. So like the more time you spend deliberating, the more you contribute. Or it's kind of like mostly sustained here. Anyways, we replicated this pattern several times, but it's just an interesting demonstration, including a few experimental twists where we also manipulated metacognitive engagement, where we see similar results, which go against the idea that, you know, just like the more time you spend thinking about something, the more you become like this rational economist. More recently, we also find, and this is with some works in my friends in economics in Germany, we decided to scale this type of thing up, where we have this convenience samples from 9 EU countries done over the course of the pandemic, the pre-registered study, multiple measures of pro-social behavior, including actual donations for climate cause, complying with COVID rules so that you don't infect others, wearing masks, not going to a party if you're sick, and so on and so forth, blood donations, volunteerism. Now, what do we find? Here you see on the y-axis standardized scores, and this is also effect sizes in standard deviations of the outcome variable. So this is a sort of like for ease of interpretation. So what you see here is that for at least half of these markers, including for donations for climate cause, actual monetary donations, following and complying with some rules that help others not to get sick, but also volunteerism, blood donations, and so on. There is a pretty robust evidence. It's remarkable because these are all the measures we had. Often when you do this type of studies, you cherry pick, which is not great, or you just pick one measure, which is also not great. But here, across the majority of them, there is quite substantial effects on very sizable samples. I want to draw your attention. This is like 1,500 per country. And in fact, this type of effects, this is now just for the donations for a climate cause, replicate in most of the countries that we sampled, except for Eastern Europe. In this case, it's Poland and Slovakia. So, I mean, we can make all sorts of interpretations why that may be the case. But I think what's striking again is overall significant contribution of this type of metacognitive processes for prosociality. Okay, another type of evidence about this type of helping with adaptive problems that's new and I'm really excited about comes from this idea that throughout human history, we've always had problems that called for somewhat different approaches for solving an issue. Sometimes ecological demands of the situation, especially in well-defined contexts, versus wicked problem context, would call you for abstract reflection on something. You would zoom out, you would think what is in common, you create a hierarchy, you focus on your concrete goals, devise a plan. You also would try to consider why you're doing this, so like in terms of the goals. And in psychology, in social psychology in particular, this is described as sort of abstract construal of the situation. Now, sometimes it's beneficial, but there are also other contexts where people may benefit, arguably, from taking this type of insider view, focusing on what's unique, like being sort of more horizontally oriented in terms of the mental representations, focusing on the transactive process, focusing on how you do things, how do you accomplish it, instead of just why you focus doing this in the first place. Now, one could arguably make a point that both of those processes are necessary for effective decision making. And what's really interesting is that when I became involved in this and started developing more robust psychometric measures of this kind of abstract and concrete construal on a given level of situation, realized that those two are not just opposites of the same dimension, but in fact sometimes can be you can be both abstract and concrete at the same time. You're switching back and forth. And so we started doing a range of studies, and what we found again and again is that here's wise reasoning on the y-axis, here's abstractness on the x-axis, and what you see here is that the more concrete you are and the more abstract you are, the higher the scores. And this is the pattern that we've seen in numerous studies, like thousands of participants, using all sorts of sort of samples, mostly from North America, though. Now, that doesn't really speak to the switching, and I find the switching is really important. Whether I think, like, if it's really ecologically adaptive, then this type of metacognitive processes they will be aligned with being able to flexibly switch from being abstract in your mindset to being concrete in your mindset. So switching is hard to measure in psychology, but I came up with I thought, like, pretty silly methodology. I would call it sort of event contingent sort of behavioral reconstruction. So here's what you do. You just engage in a reflective process about the challenging decision. And right after that, you're presented with a set of options from the psychometrically validated scale, where you have half the items being abstract and concrete. Now you can choose them in the order in which you just reflected on them, okay? And if you know now the order in which you reflect on them, you can count how many switches did people do from abstract to concrete, from abstract to concrete. So do they just do everything abstract and then concrete, or do they go back and forth? Okay, with me so far? All right, nod. Okay, so here's what we see. This is the number of switches, and this is the wise reasoning index. This is now a study done in the UK, US, Canada on prolific, 1,600 observations. Like, there's 6 scenarios, 6 decision scenarios that people reflect on. This is like a multi-level model across those. You see a pretty clear pattern. The more likely you are, the number of switches from abstract to concrete is related to wise reasoning. Again, speaking at least theoretically to this kind of adaptive nature of this process that doesn't really only zoom you out or only zoom you in, but like affords both, affords flexibility in your reasoning process. Okay, so that's a little bit about the ecological process. Now, next, this model that I talked to you and that we introduced in that psych inquiry piece about the common wisdom model really emphasizes the role of context. And the first evidence for that comes from a range of studies on sort of random samples, but I mean, still kind of not perfect, from Japan and the United States, from the Midwest, near sort of University of Michigan and Tokyo metropolitan area, where we find that if I give people scenarios to reflect on, either interpersonal stories or intergroup conflicts, and record their answers, spontaneous answers. This is a video recording, audio recordings, and then we transcribe them and look how often are they mentioning that they don't know anything about the story, that they need more information. How often are they mentioning they need other perspectives, or that they try to look at it from different angles? How often are they mentioning that there are different ways how conflict may unfold? You see again that Japanese are more likely to do that than Americans. I mean, there may be all sorts of reasons for that, but there is some evidence that context matters, at least on this kind of larger scale context. We also see similar things when we compare within the United States people from a low socioeconomic background, like less educated, to those who are more educated. Now, normally, for cognitive abilities, the pattern, unfortunately, is very clear, where people who are more educated tend to score higher on IQ tests. But here, the effect is, if anything, the opposite, but it's context specific in a domain in which you benefit from this type of metacognitive engagement, namely interpersonal domain, where you need to coordinate with others. It's blue collar people, sounds weird, people of blue collar background who would be more likely to engage in sort of perspective taking, recognizing uncertainty, compared to people of the white collar background. And we find that, again, across different measures, be it your educational level, even on the level of the situation where you have an interaction with somebody who's higher status, like your boss, you're more likely to engage in those processes than in situations in which you are the boss and you're talking to subordinates. So again, context matters. But mostly it matters because when we do experiments in which we look at situations in which it is a problem that concerns you versus concerns somebody else, there is quite a bit of variability in your propensity to express those intellectual virtues or metacognitive process, if you want. This is inspired by this story of Solomon, wise king, very wise when it comes to problems of others, pretty miserable and foolish in his own life. So we tried to test this in the context of infidelity. Imagine your partner comes to you, you've been in a long, happy relationship, and they would have no problems, and suddenly they tell you that they had sex with your closest friend. What will you do? So this is the type of situation that I presented students who are all in a monogamous, long-lasting relationship, and recorded the answers and looked for expressions of intellectual humility. With a twist, one condition was, it's you. Another condition is a friend who comes to you and tells you that that happened to them, that their partner came to them and told them the same story. And then we look at, are you willing to recognize limits of knowledge? How much do you know about this situation? Maybe it's something to explore. You've been in a stable monogamous relationship. Are you willing to compromise for the benefit of the relationship? Or should one be compromising for the benefit of the relationship? Are you willing to consider other perspectives? How many different outcomes to this type of conflict are there? So this was a silly story, but it replicated then subsequently in multiple other contexts, not only for the type of like infidelity, but also for trust betrayal, not only in the situations that were done on college students, but also on samples online, and not only in my lab, but also elsewhere. One of the main reasons for this kind of contextual difference that we find is that when you are talking about a friend, you are more likely to be zoomed out, you be an observer. Whereas when you talk about yourself, you are immersed, you are a participant. And when you're a participant, you typically look at it like this. And when you're a friend, you sometimes look at it from a third person perspective. Habitually, you do that. But the good news is that you can, if that's the mechanism, that maybe if you twist the perspective, then that would reduce or potentially eliminate this self-other asymmetry. And that's exactly what we did using the sort of linguistic manipulation of psychological distance, where you are either asked to use me and vision from a first person perspective, whether it's you or your friend situation, or envision it as he, she, what would Igor do? How would he react to it? Envision from a third person perspective. And when we do that, this difference disappears. So you would still replicate the effect when you immerse yourself in a self story. Then it's a big difference too when you think about others from a distant perspective, which you would habitually do. But now here, there is no difference when you talk about yourself in the third person. And again, this has been sort of replicated a few times. Now, this was done sort of in the lab. We've done this both with hypothetical stories, with actual autobiographical conflicts. The effect is very small. This is not a way to become wise. As most psychological effects, it's very small. So it's like some humility here, but it can be scaled up. And this is what I want to talk about next. So there was this quote by Marcel Proust. And I don't cite the French guy just because Edouard, but maybe, who said something that I found incredibly troubling, because I thought at the beginning that this is like so wrong, because he said, we don't receive wisdom. We must discover it for ourselves after a journey through the wilderness, which no one can make for us, which no one can spare us. For our wisdom is the point of view from which at last we come to view the world. And I apologize that I cannot say it in French. It probably sounds even better. But the reason why I found it troubling is because it kind of suggests, well, no, you can't train wisdom. You can't make people wiser. They have to go through those experiences. And I'm like, but I just had those studies where I could show differences as a function of particular sort of situational effects or manipulations. What is going on here? Proust is so wrong. But then I started thinking about it more. And one thing that I realized that maybe what Proust means is that you really need those personal experiences to make a difference. You really need to experience things in different contexts and enact it to potentially learn from them and generalize to some particular pattern, to change your baseline. I was like, oh, that's interesting. That's something that we could use psychologically. So maybe what one could do instead, it would be silly to bring people into the lab and try to tell them, okay, now distance yourself, and again, and then hope that that somehow would scale up and generalize to a pattern that would apply to any other context in their life outside of the lab. Because they leave the lab, they throw that informed consent and debriefing form into trash, and they forget everything about what happened there, because they just did it for credit. That's not plausible. But what Proust is talking about maybe is plausible. Maybe it is about following people in the context of their daily ecological experiences and helping them to visualize, mentalize those experiences from a particular vantage point, sampling the experiences that they go through every day, and then hopefully one by one, after a long period, shifting just a tiny bit their baseline response. So much less ambitious. And the idea resulted in this little paper with a lot of headache for research administration. So this was a team effort, really, without Anna and Harrison and Hansky, Santos, I don't think it would be possible, where we asked people to do a month-long diary. Every day, they would be recording the most important thing of the day. And they would either be doing it from a third-person perspective, it's like, how did Igor feel about the talk at the Cathedral of Learning? What did he think about his performance? Versus, what did I think about it? How did I feel about it? And so on, right? Okay, now this is a randomized controlled trial intervention where we have people assigned to two conditions that happen during the training period. Either in the third person, they write he, she, her, or in the first person, the habitual, like I would write in the first person perspective. And we have pre and post tests. So they first come into the lab, they reflect on the most recent interpersonal conflict, write down their sort of reflections, and we code it for open-mindedness, for intellectual humility, for all this metacognitive process. Then they do the diary for a month. Then they come back into the lab. They again recall the most recent interpersonal conflict. And again, we code it. Now you can see why this is a logistical nightmare. And I don't recommend it to others. I mean, I was stuck with it. So we coded for the metacognitive processes, including intellectual humility, perspective taking, consideration of change, integration of diverse viewpoints, and whether they would be willing to resolve the conflict that they're reflecting on, because these are all sort of real conflicts. And what we find is that in the control condition, where you write in the first person, there's no difference between pre and post, but in the experimental training condition, there was a difference. And if you break it down, this is not just because people are more likely to consider other perspectives when you ask them for a month to write in the third person. The effects actually scale up to intellectual humility and even to things like conflict resolution, which I find quite interesting. And that's not all. Because we were masochists, and we were thinking it's not enough to just do 1+ month study, longitudinal experiment. Why don't we continue? So at the end of the study, we asked people to consider 6 fairly mundane positive or negative scenarios they may have with somebody who is close to them. Imagine like a trust betrayal or some negative interaction with a friend, with a close friend. Now, how would you feel towards this person if this were to happen? Okay, you write down how warm, upset, trustful, angry, liking, frustrated, and content you felt towards this person. And a month later, we go back and ask people, okay, did you experience any of those 6 events? Now, if you yes, how did you actually feel? And a lot of people did. I mean, we have disagreements with friends. We have like positive things with friends. So here's what happens when we do look at that. There is greater alignment in the third person between the experiences and their predictions. Now, this is not because their predictions are more accurate. You see, there's no difference between predictions in the first and third person. This is more because in the third person, people were adjusting their actual experiences. They felt less negative towards the other person a month later. And the same type of thing, happens when we look at changes in wise reasoning as a function of the intervention. So those people who changed more in wise reasoning, they felt there was a greater convergence between the predicted, the forecasted, and the experienced emotions towards close others, compared to those who grew less or became even less sort of metacognitively involved. And by the way, this was not true for positive emotions. This will really apply mostly for negative conflicts. Anyway, it's just interesting preliminary evidence. By the way, we did replicate that intervention study for a week, because reviewers thought that one longitudinal field experiment is not enough, and that we had extra $40,000. Thank you. Thank you, reviewers. Okay, so what are the implications of this work? There are several. One that I would like to talk about, and by the way, did you notice the irony of this to Anna's presentation?
Yes. That outsourcing your judgments is much wiser.
Yeah, the whole reason I started working on the folk theories of this and pitched in the idea to Eduard was because I thought this is so trivial. Of course, everybody would be outsourcing to others. I mean, that was my prior, but I was wrong. I mean, it's kind of cute now, of course, like you may think that this is what people do and this is what actually helps. But the initial idea was that I thought that this was too trivial. And of course, everybody would be picking external. What are the implications of this? One, we talked a little bit about exemplars. Exemplars create this kind of like, they essentialize characters. So we have great admiration for Gandhi, Mother Teresa, various religious leaders, and so on. But when we, for instance, think about, well, how can we teach wisdom through them? We need to contextualize them, because if we don't contextualize them, it becomes very, very challenging to communicate the value of the potential metacognitive processes those different leaders were involved in. But there's a second layer of essentialism. Many of the measures of either wisdom writ large, specific concepts like empathy, mindfulness, intellectual humility, rationality, and so on, often go like this. You have focus on personal characteristics, and you then ask people to rate themselves. And it's, of course, kind of problematic. How good are you at perspective taking? Well, I don't know. How intellectually humble are you? Well, I don't know. Maybe the person who would be not very intellectually humble would say that they are. The problem with this is that the statements by themselves are very abstract. And if they're abstract and they're socially desirable, you would not know how to answer them except for what's socially appropriate in your society. And if it's appropriate to say that it's good to be intellectually humble, then you would say that. And often you have no base rate. I mean, it's not like you go around and keep a notebook all the time and write down after every single interaction you had with somebody how intellectually humble you were, and then create some kind of a profile of yourself and then scale it up. And then when somebody asks you, so how intellectually humble are you? You're like, oh, wait a second, I have my profile. That's not how it happens. Now, by the way, this does happen implicitly for things like neuroticism, because we do go around and compare everybody in our friendship circles, how neurotic they are, or how extroverted they are. We have like vocabulary for that, but we don't do that for this type of intellectual features. So ergo, response biases. And I mean, I don't have to go more than this person is. Now, the main problem here is also a conceptual one. That it's not just the method that it's like there's a bias, but if you go back to this kind of Aristotelian idea of practical wisdom, there's this notion that it's supposed to be about figuring out how the different strategies would fit different situations. That's what Aristotle would have described as sort of like the key feature of practical wisdom. Now, the abstract measures that we have for many of the constructs in psychology, either for measuring cognitive or metacognitive processes or sort of socio-emotional processes, are not able to do that because they're abstract. They're supposed to, by definition, apply across contexts. So instead of that, what we would need is actually look at specific situations and measure them measure those responses in the context of specific situations. And I've tried to do that over the course of the last 10 years. And so one project that we are not presenting today is actually a follow-up on the scale that Justin did his dissertation on this, and I developed, where we realized that, it's hard for psychologists not to use scales. Open-ended responses and their coding, as I've done in some of my projects, are very costly, take a lot of time, and it's hard to convince junior scientists to do that because it's a great time investment and potentially monetary investment for coders. So, okay, so how about a scale, but not an abstract scale, but a scale that would operate on the level of the situation? Now, how do you do that? Well, one way to do it is to ask people to recall actual things that happened to them. So it's not hypothetical. Reconstruct the experience by asking them, where was it, with whom was it, what time of the day was it, what were the thoughts that you had, what were the feelings you had, and then subsequently answer a set of questions about that experience. Now, those questions here are about the metacognition, but they actually can be applied to any other context that you have at least some kind of insight into. This is not a panacea. This will still be biased. There will still be response bias, but surely much less. And we know that from numerous studies than if you just use abstract measures. And by the way, so something that we don't present, but as part of the GOP, we try to scale this up to numerous societies, and it looks pretty good in the sense that the measurement properties of the construct seem to hold and look similar in various industrialized and post-industrialized societies, because obviously we did not administer a scale like this in small-scale societies. Okay, finally, what are the theoretical implications of this? So I talked about that context matters and that there is variability. And that you cannot generalize about a person from the situation, and you probably also cannot generalize from the group level to the individual level. So in general, what I argue for is that when we think about inferences about wisdom and other related constructs, we have to mind the gap, the analytical gap. For instance, here for intellectual humility, the processes that operate on the level of the situation or on the level of the individual differences are very different from the processes that may be preventing you from showing intellectual humility on the level of the group or interpersonal relations. And we are not justified drawing inferences from one just because we measured the other one. It sounds simple, but we do that all the time. We do it in cross-cultural research, we do it in cognitive and social psychology, and we just have to be mindful of that. Generally, I'm thinking that if you think about wisdom, we need to consider the context and experiences and the grounding it in a cultural context. So it may manifest itself differently across groups and across individuals and within the individuals. So that's why you actually cannot get at a good wisdom profile just by measuring it once. You cannot do it either for rationality, you cannot do it for empathy, you cannot do it for open-mindedness. Most of the constructs, there is an intra-individual variability, which in psychology, we very rarely measure. And so by chance, we may get this person D who happens to score higher than person C, just because you happen to have triggered different situations in which C would be scoring higher and D would be scoring lower. So we need sample people multiple times. So to summarize, wisdom, I think, benefits from conceptual clarity. Here, the focus has been on metacognition or wise reasoning. It seems consequential for cooperation, intergroup relations, and some forms of prosociality. It varies across contexts and can be facilitated. And by focusing and integrating the contextual ecological features in our understanding of the construct, we can actually build better instruments if you really want to push it forward, really want to change it. I mean, whether it's justifiable and we should be making people wiser, that's a different question. And now I open some room for questions.